What if I told you that the iconic stepped pyramid shape of the Empire State Building wasn't actually born from some pure, uncompromised artistic vision?
Right, which is what everyone assumes.
Exactly. What if I told you it was actually forced into existence by a completely boring bureaucratic math equation?
Yep.
Or that those incredibly luxurious multi-million-dollar residential buildings you see in the movies, they were originally designed as the 19th century equivalent of cheap, mass-produced suburban tract homes.
It is wild to think about.
It really is. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you are joining us today because we have just a fascinating stack of sources to go through with you.
We really do.
Yeah, we are pulling from archaeological reports out of the Nane Rothschild Research Center, some historical preservation documents centered on Canal Street, an EBSCO research paper on postmodern architecture.
An urban design case study, too.
Right, and a whole series of architectural essays. So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore how New York City's built environment isn't just a random collection of shelters, right?
No, not at all.
It is the physical, frozen aftermath of this centuries-long tug-of-war between strict utility, the laws, the commerce, the raw math of real estate, and wild aesthetic ambition.
And that is just a vital shift in perspective. I mean, we tend to view cities as these static concrete jungles, But when you really dig into these sources, they reveal a remarkably dynamic, evolving organism.
Yeah.
Every single brick you pass, every setback on a skyscraper, every bizarre window placement, it all tells a story of adaptation or financial compromise, and sometimes just outright rebellion.
And to really understand the mechanics of that organism, we have to start at the literal roots of the city. We have to look at the very first attempts to impose order on the landscape.
Which takes us all the way back to the 1600s, to the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam.
Right.
Now, obviously, no original urban buildings from that specific era actually survive above ground today. But archaeological digs, like the Stadhuis block excavation back in the late 1970s and early 80s, have unearthed traces of that original settlement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and what they found were yellow and red bricks. These early structures were deeply modest, typically no taller than 6 stories, with these stepped, gabled ends facing the street.
And heavy wooden shutters, right, to protect the windows.
Exactly. The ground floors were used for living, while the upper floors were just for storage. It was a purely functional design brought directly across the ocean from the Netherlands.
But the city obviously didn't stay a modest Dutch outpost for long. By the 19th century, the population is just absolutely booming. The famous rectangular street grid is laid out over the island. And, well, the city desperately needs housing.
Yes, Burley.
And because the lots on that grid are so rigid and narrow, developers had to get incredibly creative with how they maximize space. Enter the undisputed workhorse of the city's architecture. I'm talking about the row house.
Yeah, the demand for housing was just overwhelming, and land costs were incredibly high.
Yeah.
So to build quickly and cheaply, developers turned to intense speculation. They absolutely did not hire master architects to design bespoke homes.
Right, they just wanted to pump them out.
Exactly. Instead, they relied heavily on what were called pattern books.
Pattern books.
Yeah, these were essentially published catalogs with standard floor plans and architectural styles. Builders just copied them over and over.
Which meant you ended up with these perfectly orderly rows of attached 2 to 5 story houses. They shared party walls to save money, they were built with basic wood frames, and they relied on standard load-bearing brick walls.
Yep.
But the most recognizable feature of the speculative boom is where the great architectural illusion really begins. I am talking about the famous New York brownstone.
Ah, yes. Today, that term is entirely synonymous with an elite, highly romanticized urban lifestyle.
Oh, totally.
But the sources point out something that completely shatters that illusion. Brownstone is not some structural marvel or like a premium building material. It is strictly a facade.
Right.
It is literally just a relatively soft, reddish-brown sandstone quarried from places like Connecticut and New Jersey.
And I really have to push back on the modern obsession with these buildings because people today treat them like artisanal, bespoke luxury. But if you look at the mechanics of how they were built, developers essentially took the cheapest, ugliest brick boxes they could construct.
Absolute cheapest.
Yeah, and they just glued a thin veneer of this brown sandstone onto the front to trick buyers into thinking the building was made of solid, expensive masonry. It's like, well, they were the 19th century equivalent of suburban tract homes.
This really were.
And the irony is, high society back then saw right through the gimmick. Edith Wharton, the famous novelist, she openly despised it. The sources quote her saying the city was, quote, cursed with its universal chocolate-colored coating.
She certainly wasn't alone in that sentiment.
Yeah.
Critics at the time thought the endless rows of brown sandstone were incredibly drab, just totally monotonous. But, what's fascinating here is why the row house endured so successfully despite that heavy criticism and its cheap speculative origins.
Why?
Well, first, it appealed to a very strong Anglo-Saxon cultural bias at the time toward the idea of a quote-unquote house and individual land ownership. Even if you were sharing walls with your neighbors, you felt like you owned a house. But the real genius of the row house was its endless internal adaptability.
Oh, because the physical shell of the building didn't have to change even when the demographics of the neighborhood completely flipped?
Precisely. The exact same architectural box could serve entirely different socioeconomic purposes over a century. So initially you had upper-class single families where strict social customs dictated the layout, right?
Right, like the parlor floor.
Exactly. The parlor floor on the first elevated level was strictly for entertaining guests, while the kitchen was hidden below and the bedrooms were above. But, roll the clock forward to the mid-20th century, and that exact same row house might be subdivided into a rooming house.
Wow.
Yeah, a physical space originally designed for a single family of 5 was suddenly housing 12 or 15 people in separate units. The building simply absorbed the changing needs of the city.
So in the residential sector, you have this massive drive to mass-produce buildings using cheap facades that fake the look of expensive stone. But that mindset didn't stay confined to residential neighborhoods.
Not at all.
The exact same desire to fake luxury on a budget directly fueled a total revolution in commercial architecture. And that takes us downtown to Canal Street.
Specifically to a building at 254 to 260 Canal Street. This was constructed in 1856 and 57. You see, by the mid-19th century, the city was transforming into a massive commercial hub. The booming retail trade needed a new kind of building, the commercial palace.
The commercial palace.
Yeah, they wanted structures that projected immense wealth and stability.
But carving a commercial palace out of solid marble or granite, that takes years and costs an absolute fortune.
Right.
So to solve that problem, the sources introduce us to 2 incredible innovators. First, there's George Bruce. He's a pioneer in the printing industry who figured out how to cast metal type at an unprecedented speed, like 100 characters a minute.
Which was huge back then.
Massive. So he makes a fortune automating metalwork and buys up real estate. And then he hires a guy named James Bogardus.
Bogardus is a truly fascinating figure. He wasn't trained as an architect. He was a watchmaker, an inventor, someone who deeply understood engraving and die sinking.
Okay.
He looked at architecture not as an artist, but as a mechanic. He realized that the same techniques used to mass-produce small metal gears could be scaled up to mass-produce entire buildings. So he became a pioneer of cast iron architecture.
The audacity of Bogardus is just incredible to me. Before him, if you wanted a commercial building to look like an elegant Italianate palazzo-like, the incredibly expensive stone buildings popularized by Sir Charles Barry in England, you had to hire armies of skilled masons.
Right.
But Bogardus realized you could just pour molten iron into sand molds shaped like Corinthian columns or keystones carved like Medusa heads.
Yeah.
You could even cast iron panels with imitation rustication, which, for anyone visualizing this, rustication is when builders cut deep V-shaped grooves between massive stone blocks to make a building look heavy and fortress-like.
Exactly.
Bogardus just molded those deep grooves right into thin, lightweight iron panels, painted the whole thing white to look like marble, and bolted it to the front of a standard brick warehouse.
It was an absolute triumph of industrial prefabrication. But beyond the aesthetic trickery, cast iron provided massive structural benefits. Because iron is exponentially stronger than stone under compression, the columns supporting the front of the building could be much thinner. And thinner columns meant you could install incredibly wide glass windows. In an era before reliable electric lighting, getting natural sunlight deep into a retail store was literally a matter of financial survival.
That makes total sense.
Plus, developers aggressively marketed these iron facades as fireproof, which was a huge selling point in a densely packed city.
Though the sources dryly note the irony there, because the structural brick floors and timber beams right behind the fancy iron facade were still highly flammable.
Yeah, and many of those fireproof buildings burned straight to the ground.
Yeah. But I look at Bogardus's invention and I just see an adult Lego set.
A Lego set, yeah.
You didn't need a master mason. A developer could just open a catalog, point to a Venetian palazzo design, wait for the iron parts to be shipped on a train, and then semi-skilled laborers could just bolt the facade together on site in a matter of weeks.
And that precise mechanical repetition absolutely outraged architectural critics at the time. They condemned the practice. They argued that bolting together endless identical cast iron bays was amorphous and totally lacking in artistic soul. It just felt cheap to them.
Right.
But proponents fought back. A defender named Henry Van Brunt argued that this was the age of aggregates. He said that this strict mechanical obedience, the honest repetition of industrial parts, was actually the most beautiful expression of the new mechanized era.
But the real legacy of iron isn't just about faking marble palaces. Because iron is so strong, it inevitably changes the physical limits of the city. Suddenly, buildings don't have to stop at 5 or 6 stories. They can push upward.
We absolutely did. And reaching for the sky created an immediate, massive crisis down on the street level.
Oh, yeah.
By the early 1900s, you had these early skyscrapers, like the 1915 Chrysler Building, rising straight up from the sidewalk for 40 stories. Because property owners wanted to maximize every square inch of their land, they built straight up, like massive cliffs of solid masonry.
Yeah.
The result was that these gigantic buildings blocked out the sun, plunging the streets below into permanent, freezing shadows. The public outcry was deafening.
People suddenly realized that if they didn't implement rules, the streets would become dark, airless canyons. Which brings us to a piece of bureaucratic legislation that completely accidentally created the most famous skyline in the world, the 1916 zoning resolution.
Right, and the law did two main things. First, it divided the city into distinct districts by use so communal, residential, or unrestricted. Second, and far more consequentially, it created strict setback formulas to preserve natural light and air on the streets.
Setbacks, yeah.
So you could build straight up from the sidewalk for a certain number of stories, but after that, the building's facade had to step back inward, staying behind a defined diagonal angle drawn from the center of the street.
But the city planners left a loophole in the math.
A massive one. The law states that a central tower could rise to absolutely unlimited height, but only if that tower took up no more than 25% of the lot's total area.
See, here's where it gets really interesting. You have real estate developers who are spending millions of dollars, and their only goal is to maximize every single inch of profitable space. Suddenly, they are handed this complex legal math equation dictating exactly where they cannot build. So in 1922, a delineator named Hugh Ferris and an architect named Harvey Wiley Corbett actually drew out what this legal formula looked like in 3D.
Yep.
They published a series called 4 Stages of the Maximum Mass of the Zoning Envelope. They literally visualized how to carve the maximum renderable square footage out of this invisible legal boundary. It's like giving an artist an incredibly restrictive canvas size, and they use it to paint a masterpiece.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it perfectly illustrates the ultimate rule of that era. Form follows finance.
Form follows finance.
Exactly. The developers demanded maximum rentable space, but the architects had to contend with a harsh physical reality.
The 28-foot rule, right. This is the invisible mechanism that I think completely redefines how you look at these massive buildings.
Yes, the 28-foot rule.
Yeah.
Before the invention of cheap, reliable fluorescent lighting, natural sunlight was everything. Architects knew that a worker sitting at a desk could not read a piece of paper if they were more than 28 feet away from a window.
Right.
The light simply didn't penetrate any deeper than that. So
Yeah.
you couldn't just build a massive, solid, square block of a skyscraper because the entire center of the building would be pitch black and completely unrentable.
Which means the floor plans of these giant buildings are actually optical illusions. When you look at them from the street, they look solid. But if you were to slice them in half and look from above, they are actually shaped like giant letter U's or letter O's or E's.
Yep.
They have these massive hollow courtyards carved right down the middle of them, just to ensure that no single desk is ever more than 28 feet from a window.
And that is the genius of the era. The architects took the strict financial imperative of the 28-foot rule, combined it with the strict legal math of the 1916 setback rules, and they disguised that entire logistical headache as a majestic, towering monument.
Wow.
That bureaucratic restriction is what accidentally gave birth to the Art Deco stepped pyramid shape of the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building.
It's amazing. I also love that the massive heights of these new towers exposed another mechanical problem that had to be solved with highly visible, purely functional infrastructure: the wooden water towers.
Ah, yes. As buildings grew taller than 6 stories, you couldn't rely on the municipal water pressure to push water to the top floors. If the city engineers cranked the underground water pressure high enough to reach the 10th floor, it would literally burst the older pipes at the street level.
Oh, wow.
So the law required buildings to put wooden water tanks on the roofs and rely on gravity to pull the water down to the apartments. It is a piece of 19th century barrel-making technology sitting on top of 20th century steel skyscrapers.
That is wild. So for decades, this relentless doctrine of form follows finance and strict functionalism dictates everything. And eventually, after World War II, this evolves into the stark international-style glass boxes,
Yes.
like Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building in the 1950s.
Right.
Just sheer vertical walls of glass and extruded bronze, no historical fluff, no ornamentation, just pure, cold structural honesty. But when you build hundreds of purely functional glass boxes, the skyline loses its humanity.
People started to feel profoundly alienated by these uniform utilitarian cages. They lacked a human scale. The pendulum had swung way too far toward cold utility, which made an architectural rebellion absolutely inevitable.
Yeah.
And that rebellion arrived in 1984 with the completion of the AT&T building, designed by Philip Johnson and John Burgee.
This building is such a brilliant provocation because it completely abandons the glass box aesthetic. First of all, it's clad in pinkish gray granite, which already felt incredibly retro at the time.
Very retro.
But the real shock is when you look at the top of the tower. Instead of a flat, highly efficient, functional roof, it has this massive broken pediment. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it literally looks like the top of a giant antique Chippendale grandfather clock with a swooping arch on each side and a dramatic circular notch cut right out of the exact middle.
The shockwaves this sent through the architectural world cannot be overstated. You have to remember, Philip Johnson was the man who curated the famous 1932 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art that literally introduced the stark, modernist glass box to America.
Right.
For him to suddenly reject form follows function and slap a massive historical ornament on a skyscraper was architectural heresy to purists.
It honestly feels like he was daring people to be mad. I look at the AT&T building and it's like seeing someone wearing a vintage 18th century top hat paired with a modern corporate business suit. I read the sources and I kept wondering, is this a deeply serious homage to historical utopian architecture, or did they just build a 600-foot-tall grandfather clock as an inside joke?
It is definitely playful, but it had a deeply serious impact on the urban environment. This raises an important question about what we actually need from our buildings beyond just shelter.
Right.
The AT&T building legitimized postmodernism. It proved to the corporate world that a building didn't have to be a cold, expressionless grid. The AT&T chairman specifically wanted a building that was instantly recognizable, a symbol that communicated stability and history. Johnson delivered that by proving that architecture could and should integrate historically inspired ornamentation to connect with our cultural memory.
Which is a profound ideological shift. If the AT&T building was a rebellion that proved the value of adding quote-unquote useless ornamentation to a functional corporate headquarters, the city's next great architectural triumph flips that script entirely.
It does.
Because the ultimate aesthetic statement isn't building a new ornament from scratch, it's taking a piece of purely functional, completely obsolete, dangerous industrial infrastructure and upcycling that into the ornament.
Which brings us to the High Line.
Yes. Let's talk about the origins of the West Side Elevated Line, because they are incredibly grim. Back in the mid-1800s, you had massive freight trains running right on the street level down 10th and 11th Avenues to serve the meat packing and manufacturing warehouses.
And the streets were crowded with pedestrians, carts, and workers, and the street-level trains were deadly. Hundreds of people were killed. 10th Avenue literally became known as Death Avenue.
Death Avenue.
The city even tried hiring men on horses, called West Side Cowboys, to ride in front of the moving trains and wave red flags to warn people out of the way. But the carnage simply continued.
So the city finally agrees to lift the trains off the street. The elevated steel line opens in 1933 or 34, running directly through the middle of the city blocks, sometimes literally passing right through the second floors of factories like the Nabisco building so they could load cargo indoors. Yeah. But its lifespan was surprisingly short.
It was. Post-World War II, decentralization changed the entire logistics network of the country. The massive rise of the interstate highway system and commercial trucking meant the city no longer relied on those trains. The traffic steadily dwindled until the very last train ran in 1980, supposedly carrying a few carloads of frozen turkeys.
Frozen turkeys.
Yeah. After that, the massive steel structure was simply abandoned.
And as it sat there rusting for decades, the real estate developers naturally wanted it torn down. It was considered a massive, ugly eyesore blocking new development. In fact, Mayor Giuliani wanted it demolished.
He did.
But from the street level, people couldn't see what was naturally occurring 30 feet up in the air. A wild, resilient landscape had taken root in the gravel and the rotting wooden ties. It had become a continuous ribbon of green running silently through the dense concrete city.
Preserving that hidden world required a massive paradigm shift in civic thinking. In the 1960s, the prevailing mindset was urban renewal, which usually meant indiscriminately bulldozing the past. The most tragic example of that era being the demolition of the original majestic Penn Station in 1963. But by the early 2000s, local advocates, specifically the Friends of the High Line, founded by Joshua David and Robert Hammond, and Joel Sternfeld's incredible photographs, shifted the narrative. They realized they didn't have to bulldoze the tracks to revitalize the neighborhood.
Right. Instead of viewing the structure as garbage, they engaged in the ultimate act of spatial upcycling. It's like taking a rusted, dangerous old tractor you find in an abandoned barn, and instead of throwing it away, you upcycle it into $1 million dining room table.
That's a great way to put it.
It's just brilliant. You use the exact same steel I-beams as the architectural trellis for a massive elevated botanical garden.
And the design concept was brilliantly termed agritecture. The design team, James Cornerfield Operations, Diller Scofidio plus Renfro and Pete Adolph, they didn't just clear the tracks and plant a traditional boring lawn. They leaned into the mechanism of decay. They meticulously preserved the industrial heritage, the steel rails, the peeling concrete, and structurally integrated them with discrete units of soft, wild landscaping. The root systems of the plants are interwoven with the rigid geometry of the tracks.
It's stunning.
It really is. And the High Line proved the immense, tangible value of adaptive reuse. By preserving that industrial heritage rather than destroying it, the 1.45-mile park completely revitalized the surrounding neighborhoods. The sources note it generated $5 billion in real estate investment and $1.4 billion in tax revenue, accommodating 7 million visitors a year.
Wow. It's an incredible journey we've been on today. We started with modest Dutch gabled roofs built from imported yellow brick. We saw the rise of the chocolate brownstone, mass-produced to hide cheap masonry. We watched James Bogardus bolt together cast iron Venetian palazzi just to let natural sunlight into retail stores. We saw how a bureaucratic math equation, combined with the 28-foot limitation of natural light, ended up sculpting the glorious Art Deco pyramids of the 1920s. We saw a postmodern grandfather clock masquerading as a corporate headquarters to bring humanity back to the skyline. And finally, we walked along a rusted train track that used to be a site of death and industry, completely upcycled into a thriving public park.
Quite a story.
So, what does this all mean? Next time you walk down a city street, I want you to look up, really look. Realize that every cornice, every strange stepped-back terrace on a skyscraper, every fake stone facade, and every U-shaped courtyard isn't just a random design choice made by a solitary artist. It is the physical, frozen result of a fierce argument between an architect, an accountant, and the law.
And knowing that leaves us with a fascinating lingering question. If our past is defined by disguising new technology of old styles, like Bogardus using mass-produced cast iron to pretend he built a stone palace, and our present is defined by turning obsolete technology into public parks like the High Line, what will future generations do with our current architecture? Right now, we are obsessed with building these massive green-certified, entirely